Hi. Today we are going to learn about inverse functions. What is an inverse function? An inverse function is a function that undoes or reverses the action of another function. So let's move to the formal definition. Let f and g be two functions such that f of g of x is equals to x for all x in the domain of g, and g of f of x is equals to x for all x in the domain of f. The function g is the inverse of the function f and is denoted as f inverse. Thus, f of f inverse of x is equals to x and f inverse of f of x is equals to x. The domain of x is equals to the range of f inverse and vice versa. Let's move to a simple example where you can understand the definition of an inverse of a function. So let the function f takes the values 1 to 3, 2 to 6 and 3 to 9. That is, if we input 1, 2 and 3, this function will gives out 3, 9 and 6. So when we input 1, this function will give out 3, and when we input 2, this function will give out 6, and if we input 3, this function will give out 9. So that is the function f. And then if we have a function which will provide 1 when we input 3 and 3 when we input 9 and 2 when we input 6, that function can be identified as the inverse function of f. Let's try to verify inverse of functions. So show that each function is the inverse of the other. So we have given f of x is equals to 4x plus 9 and g of x is equals to x minus 9 divided by 4. So the solution is, first you need to find out f of g of x. This is similar. This is the f composed with g. So what you should do is, you need to substitute g of x in x of f of x. So you need to substitute x minus 9 divided by 4 in x in the expression, in the equation 4x plus f of x is equals to 4x plus 9. So it will give you x as the answer, and then you have to compute g of f of x, where you substitute 4x plus 9 in the place of x in x minus 9 divided by 4, and then this also gives out x as the output. So f of g of x is equals to g of f of g of f of x. So therefore f and g are inverse functions. So to find the inverse of a function, you need to follow some steps. So step 1 is, replace f of x with y in the given equation for f of x. Step 2, you have to interchange x and y. Step 3, solve for y. Step 4, if this equation does define y as function of x, then the function of f has an inverse function. If this does not define y as a function of x, then the function of f does not have an inverse function. Then step 4 is, if f has an inverse function, we need to replace y in step 3 by f inverse of x, and then we can verify our result by showing f of f inverse of x is equals to x and f inverse of f of x is equals to x. So let's explore more using an example. So find the inverse of f of x is equals to 3x minus 1. Step 1. Replace f of x with y in the given equation for f of x. So our equation is f of x is equals to 3x minus 1. In step 1, we have to replace f of x with y. Let's move to step 2. That is, interchange x and y. So, originally, y equals 3x minus 1 now. In step 2, we need to interchange x and y. And then let's move to step 3. You need to solve for y. So our equation is now x equals 3y minus 1. So you need to solve for y now. Now y equals x plus 1 is divided by 3. Y equals x plus 1 divided by 3 now. And then let's move to step 4. That is, if f has an inverse function, replace y in step 3 by f inverse of x. Yes, we have an inverse function. So what we should do is, we have to replace y, which we obtained from step 3, with f inverse of x. So now f inverse of x is equals to x plus 1 divided by 3. So we obtain the inverse function of f of x equals to 3x minus 1, which is f inverse of x is equals to x plus 1 divided by 3. So if we need to check whether a function is, if we need to check whether a function has an inverse, we use horizontal line test. So horizontal line test means if a graph crosses the horizontal line at 2 points, then that graph does not have an inverse function. If a graph crosses the horizontal line at 2 points, then that graph does not have an inverse. But if a graph crosses the horizontal line at 1 point, then that graph has an inverse. So generally, if a graph crosses the horizontal line at 1 point, then that graph has an inverse. Now, we are going to graph f and f inverse. So, the graph of f inverse is the reflection of the graph of f about the line y equals x. So, if you need to find the inverse function given a function, then what you should do is use the knowledge of transformations and take the reflection of the graph about y equals x-axis. So this is the line y equals x, and then let's say we are going to graph the function y equals fx. So then, in order to graph the graph f inverse of x, take the reflection of y equals f of x about y equals x-axis. So this is y equals f inverse of x, which is the reflection of graph of y f about the line y equals x.